Hello everyone, my name is Luca Sarti and I am a PhD student at University of Naples L'Orientale. Before we get started, I would like to thank the organizing committee of Let's Talk About Sex in Young Adults for organizing the conference despite the pandemic. I wish I could do this at the University of Cambridge, which one day I hope to visit, but none of us knew, to put it in the words of Albus Dumbledore, that we were going to face dark and difficult times, and therefore all we can do is to go with the flow. It goes without saying that I'm thrilled to be here and present my talk entitled Dealing with Sexuality in Fairy Tales, the case of Tangleweed and Brine. How shall we spend the next 20 minutes together? After an introduction of the evolution of sexuality in the fairy tale genre from Basile to the 20th century, I will introduce J.J. Sullivan's Tangleweed and Brine, a collection of feminist retellings of classic fairy tales that I will explore considering how they deal with sexuality. Therefore, my main research question is how and to what end is sexuality addressed in Sullivan's adaptations of classic fairy tales for young adults? Let's start with a brief overview of the evolution of sexuality in the fairy tale genre, through a short ride from Basile, from Europe to America. Clearly, my intention is not to do a history of the genre, but to mention some of its milestones in order to see how the handling of sexuality evolved. I decided to use the word sexuality in this way to refer to both sex, understood as the activity of sexual intercourse, and sexuality, someone's ability to experience or express sexual feelings, attitudes, and activities relating to sex. Before starting the short ride, I would like to point out that fairy tales have not been born as stories for children. Indeed, traditionally folk tales were related at adult gatherings after the children had been put to bed for the night. Therefore, peasant raconteurs could take certain liberties with their diction and give free play to their penchant for sexual innuendo or off-color allusions. Our first stop is Italy, where the first recorded literary versions of well-known fairy tales appeared. In the 1550s, Giovanni Francesco Straparola published Le Piacevoli Notti, considered the first European storybook to include fairy tales. Decade after, the Neapolitan Giambattista Basile collected dozens of fairy tales in the Neapolitan language, which were published between 1634 and 1636 as Lo Conto degli Conti, ovvero Lo Trattenimento dei Piccirilli, also known as the Pentamerone. As Jack Zipes points out, it is the first integral collection consisting entirely of fairy tales to appear in Europe. Despite its title, which refers to the little ones, it was destined to be read aloud in the courtly conversations that were an elite pastime of this period. Thus, it is not surprising that the stories collected are often bawdy, irreverent, erotic, and frank. For example, in Sole, Luna e Talia, later become famous as Sleeping Beauty, themes such as defloration, rape, adultery, and pregnancy are addressed. Indeed, Princess Talia, after being raped by a merry king while sleeping, gives birth to twins. We can find some references to sexuality also in the late 17th century France, when, as Debs highlights, numerous gifted female writers such as Madame d'Aulnoy introduced fairy tales into their literary salons, and their tales, along with those of Charles Perrault, initiated a mode or craze that prepared the ground for the institution of the literary fairy tale as a genre. Notably, it was also women who coined the very expression conte de fées, found in the title of the Aulnoy collection Le Conte de Fées, which was translated to give the English tales of the fairies and eventually fairy tale. Although in the vast majority of the contes de fées explicit descriptions of sexuality are consistently avoided during that time, some tales by Perrault and Aulnoy contain what might be called sexually suggestive and sexually explicit allusions and descriptions to, to topics like incestus or homoerotic desire. Moving towards the beginning of the 19th century, we can notice that sexuality distinguished the collection of the Grimm brothers. To be more precise, sexuality was a recurring element in the first of the seven editions of Kinder und Ausmachen, published between 1812 and 1815. As title highlights, in Sex and Violence, the hardcore of fairy tales, sex along with violence is one of the major thematic concerns of tales in the Grimm's collection, at least in their unedited form. When it came to passages colored by sexual details, William Grimm exhibited extraordinary editorial zeal. Over the years, he systematically purged the collection of reference to sexuality. The elimination of references to unwanted pregnancies, the introduction of marriage before displaying the marriage bed, and the explicit condemnation of deviant behavior helped silencing critics and appeasing parental objections to the first edition of Nursery and Household Tales. During the 19th century, the collection was gradually transformed from a scholarly tome into a book for a wide audience. In other words, the Grimm's tales were changed into entertaining and moral tales for children, and sexuality was completely erased. This transformation reached its peak in America, where many European fairy tales, or rather their English or anglicized versions, were Americanized to suit the American context. This phenomenon intensified after 1945 when the United States became a political and cultural superpower dominating the market of fairy tales. Consequently, fairy tales were trivialized, infantilized, and commercially exploited. Notably, this process of Americanization could also be called globalized Disneyfication, because after World War II, the cinematic Americanization of the classic fairy tales were dominated by the Disney mode of production and ideology. Indeed, Disney established a model of conformity that hundreds of other filmmakers have followed up until today. In Breaking the Disney Spell, Zipes describes Disney as a sort of wizard putting a spell on the fairy tales, as we can read in this quote. It was at a certain time in history that Disney cast a spell on the fairy tale. He employed the most up-to-date technological means and used his own American grit and ingenuity to appropriate European fairy tales. His signature has obscured the names of Charles Perrault and the Brothers Grimm. If children or adults think of the great classical fairy tales today, they will think of Walt Disney. In other words, Walt Disneyfied his European source material, simplifying narrative, adding new characters and creatures, introducing comedy and music, and highlighting the sentimentality. He made the opening Once Upon a Time and the closing Happily Ever After a mark of his cartoons, and most importantly, although he was by no means the first one to disguise or eliminate sex from the surface of tales, he continued on this path. In this regard, it should be said that many notice that Disney cartoons hide sexual references. As Harrison stresses, some of the jokes are visual and shockingly obvious, while others are hidden in the script. To give you an idea, I will show you some examples taken from some online articles. We can find naked and half-naked ladies, as on the Lion King's poster, as well as rough penises, as on the home video cover art of The Little Mermaid, where a phallic-shaped tower appears in King Trajan's castle, and in a scene from Hercules, in which Nissus' head bump has the shape of a penis, and his eyebrows look extremely like testicles. Furthermore, in Aladdin and the King of Thieves, the genie alludes to passionate sexual intercourse when he says, I thought the earth wasn't supposed to move until the honeymoon. And many claim that in Frozen, there is a penis joke when Anna says, foot size doesn't matter. Lastly, leaving this frame from Cinderella's side, which taken out of context is quite an image, we can recognize the word sex incorporated in Rapunzel's hair on the poster for Tangled, and appearing in a cloud of dust in The Lion King. In this case, according to former Disney animator Tom Sito, The word isn't a subliminal sexual message. It suggests a shout out of the special effects department. It says special effects, it's SFX. While Disney has never admitted to any of its innuendos, as Bonner suggests, Sato pretty much confirmed that cartoonists used to put little jokes in films. And this is not surprising considering that Disney films usually address a dual audience, that is both children and adults. If these are coincidences or not, we will never know. But what we do know is that Disney contributed to the spread of a fairy tale model focusing on romantic and heterosexual love, reinforcing fixed gender roles in stories fitting in a patriarchal, phallocentric, and heteronormative society. And patriarchy, phallocentrism, and heteronormativity are precisely the main target of feminist fairy tale adaptations in which sexuality plays a pivotal role. According to Zipes, if Disney marked one sort of revolution in the fairy tale genre, the feminist fairy tale production marked a second one by breathing new life into the genre. Precisely, it was the feminist and civil rights movement that called for a revising of the literary canon, inspiring numerous writers to recreate and reutilize fairy tales. The more profound transformation occurred largely in the domain of young adult and adult literature. In my study, I employed the term adaptation to refer to these feminist retellings. According to Linda Hutchen, adaptation is an announced and extensive transposition of a particular work or works. This transcoding can involve a change of frame and therefore context. Telling the same story from a different point of view, for instance, can create a manifestly different interpretation. Notably, feminist adaptations can be defined as activist adaptations, defined by Cristina Bacchilega as retellings that take a questioning stance toward their pretexts. Indeed, the term activist here refers to an adaptation's responses to authoritative pretexts, as well as to the response to it instigates in listeners, readers, and viewers. As Donald Haas stresses, scholarly research devoted to feminist issues in fairy tale studies began in 1970. Specifically, as the examined collection shows, feminist fairy tale criticism aims to raise awareness of how fairy tales function to maintain traditional gender constructions and difference, and how they might be utilized to counter the destructive tendencies of patriarchal values. In the last decades, many writers, from Margaret Atwood to Barbara Walker, have written counter-hegemonic fairy tales. In many adaptations, traditional sexuality has been amply questioned. An example of this is Anne Sexton's Transformations, which includes 25 highly provocative verse renditions of the Grimm's tales that question the treatment of women in the stories. For instance, she addresses the issue of virginity in the poetic retelling of Snow White and that of incest in the retelling of Briar Rose. Another example is Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber and Other Stories. The British writer had no interest in presenting a one-dimensional view of women, let alone heroines without sexuality. She has represented the physical abuse of women in phallocentric cultures and the women who grab their sexuality and fight back. Indeed, in this collection, we can find a case of necrophilia in the Snow Child, as well as an uninhibited and sexy Little Red Riding Hood sleeping with the wolf. Finally, in Emma Donoghue's Kissing the Witch or Tales in New Skins, which unmasks naturalized constructions of gender and sexuality through tales of non-normative subjects and desires that actively resist heteropatriarchal ideologies, we find allusions to sexual intercourse in the tale of the voice, based on Andersen's Little Mermaid, and queer desire in the tale of the rose, based on Madame Le Prince de Beaumont, Beauty and the Beast. Tangleweed and Brine follows this tradition, and I will explore it considering how it deals with sexuality in 5 adaptations, looking forward to examining the issues at stake in more depth during the Q&A section in May. Because of time, I will not illustrate the synopsis, but I am sure that you will have a chance to search online for the plots of the stories you are not familiar with. Besides, while addressing sexuality, I will touch on some of the previous versions of the fairy tales analyzed. Tangleweed and Brine is a multi-awarded collection of fairy tales adapted for young adults by J.J. Sullivan, illustrated by Karen Vaughan, and published by Little Island Books in 2017. It was expanded in 2018 with the addition of a 14th story. Gigi Sullivan is an Irish writer and teacher. She is the author of several books, including Needlework, a novel dealing with domestic violence and child sexual abuse, and Savage Her Reply, an adaptation of The Children of Lear. In her opinion, retelling fairy tales is like shaping the meat on the old bones of a tale, according to the character and moral of the teller. Her book is a collection of bewitched retellings of 13 classic fairy tales with brave and resilient heroines, which has been widely praised by writers and critics, including the judges at the Children's Book Ireland Awards, who defined it as a significant and timely contribution to Irish young adult literature and feminist literature for young people. The collection is divided into Tangled Tales of the Earth on the left and Salty Tales of Water on the right. Those highlighted in pink are the ones I chose to explore in the study, while I have highlighted in blue the adaptation added in the second edition of the book. In the words of Bakilega, we can define these adaptations as postmodern transformations of fairy tales, since they disrupt both genre and gender boundaries, an issue widely examined by Kathleen Preston in the tales adapted. The first one is Comely Fair and Beloved, the adaptation of the tale of Rapunzel, told in the second person as usually happens in the book. In this version, Sullivan restores the sexual element included in Basile's Petrosinella and the first edition of the Grimm's collection, later deleted in the following editions and eventually by Disney in Tangled. Notably, here sexuality is reintroduced not through Rapunzel, who doesn't even appear in the story, but through her pregnant mother. In this adaptation, pregnancy is neither a suggestion nor a taboo, but becomes a central topic. As we can see from these few quotations in which sentences such as this small quick thing that moves inside and you feel the baby moving stand out, the whole story revolves around the complicated pregnancy of Rapunzel's mother, who is also portrayed with her pregnant belly touched by the witch in the illustration that enriches the tale. The tale of Fair Brown and Trembling, the Irish variant of Cinderella, is adapted in Sister Fair. Maybe for the first time, Sullivan includes sexuality in the story transcribed by Jeremiah Cartin in 1890 and recently retold by Malachi Doyle and Catherine Kroll. Specifically, she addresses sexual objectification of women and reproduction, highlighting that young girls are often treated as objects within their families. In this adaptation, in addition to the pejorative and obsolete representation of women as angels of the earth, the distinction between men as subjects and women as objects is underlined as the fairy tale develops. In the patriarchal society depicted, women can't have safety without a baby. Men see them as nothing more than beauty and a womb. But Fair, who is the version to who in this version turns from evil sister to heroine, decides to react by seducing and killing the man who threatens the happiness of her sister Trembling, the Irish Cinderella, sacrificing her virginity. In The Tender Weight, Sullivan adapts the tale of Bluebird, While violence in the form of femicide has always characterized the story, sexuality was added at a later moment. For example, in the adaptation entitled The Bloody Chamber, Angela Carter addresses pornography and intercourse, which represents a central issue in this adaptation. Indeed, Sullivan describes vivid sex scenes between Bluebird and his less young wife, who married as soon as she was able, a week after the first blood course arrived. She describes their first night together, how she loses her virginity and signs the marriage contract with her blood, how she discovers the pleasures of sex, and how she chooses to love that man who is anything but a monster. In Riverbed, the tale of Donkey Skin is adapted. This time the story is told in the first person, which corresponds to the voice of the princess. As we can see in the table, sexuality in the form of incestuous desire has always been included in retelling the story, especially in Donahue's adaptation. However, here it is addressed differently. First of all, the issue of incest is addressed explicitly. The protagonist defines it as a sin, but she doesn't run away, she doesn't hide. On the contrary, she chooses to stay and fight back, seducing her father and, in the end, transforming him into a fish. In this way, she becomes a queen. The last fairy tale examined is The Little Gift, the adaptation of The Goose Girl, told through the voice of Rilla, the princess maiden. In this story, Sullivan introduces sexuality by addressing same-sex sexual desire, intercourse, and love, focusing on young girls discovering their sexuality and feelings. Before the maiden switches places with the princess, they spend some days and nights together as lovers. The first night of passion takes place beside the fire, as you can see in this stunning black and white illustration, and it begins like this. And she's close to me. Every part of me is on the surface. Our hands entangle now, and mesh together, and we are kissing. Several kinds of sin, and all at once. I learn more of her, the sound she makes, the tremors and shocks my hands can offer. As you can see, the scene is described vividly, while never being rude or vulgar. On the contrary, it is poetic. To sum up, it is possible to say that sexuality takes many forms in Sullivan's counter-hegemonic adaptations, and helps stories to convey several meaningful messages, subverting the hegemonic heteropatriarchal patterns of the fairy tale. After all, this is a collection for young adults, and we all know that sexuality is crucial in their development as human beings, as are fairy tales, because they have a fundamental role in the construction of an identity, be it social, national, individual, or sexual. Indeed, sexuality, as addressed by Sullivan, not only helps young readers to reflect on the condition of women in contemporary societies, but it also helps them to think deeply about their own sexual life and sexuality, showing that a wide range of possibility exists. To better highlight this point, I wish to conclude by reading Dype's comment in praise of the collection, which says, Gilda Sullivan's terse and stark renditions of fairy tales challenge us to rethink what the destinies of young women were in traditional fairy tales, and she spells out what they might really be in other times and settings. Sullivan's original stories are riveting and offer readers unusual perspectives on how to read fairy tales in times of conflict. Here you can find the work cited, and here too. Thank you all for your attention and see you on the 3rd of May.